Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our exploration through the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2021. And that brings us, therefore, to that film which has been designated at spy number 1066. And this is a film from 2005. The filmmaker is Ramin Bahrani. And the name of this work is Man Push Cart. This is the work from 2005 from Ramin Bahrani, and we understand that this is his feature film debut. We are speaking, of course, of this work, Man Push Cart. And I think if we were to try to focus in on the plot element or the essence of the story, we would be drawn to the main character of this film, Ahmed. And we as viewers follow him, we are engaged with him, we see the routines that are part of his daily life as this vendor in a food cart that is a sort of mobile food cart that sells coffee and donuts and bagels, etc. And this is a mobile cart that is stationed in a specific part of New York City, Manhattan. And also we see the routine of Ahmed having to, for example, essentially bring the cart from a considerable distance every day to this location in Manhattan and then bring it back. And then also we see his interactions with the various people that he meets, perhaps on a somewhat daily basis. That includes customers, that also includes other vendors, other cart vendors. And those relationships become part of the key of the plot of the film, but also the key or keys to trying to understand what the background is of our main character Ahmed, and what it is he is going through, and what his ultimate struggle is as a human being, as an individual, and his own feelings and emotions and his background. And so we see that it all revolves around his current existence as we follow it as the basis of the story, as this food cart vendor, and all of his efforts in trying to achieve those goals that he has for reasons that may become clear as we watch the film. Those goals that he has set for himself, both perhaps emotionally and also economically and financially. And so this, I think, forms the essential basis of the plot and the drive towards its conclusion. And of course, therefore, at the center of this is our main character of Ahmed. In this exploration, of course, though, we have many different types of themes or concerns that are in operation in this film, Man Push Cart, and they are, I would suggest, operating on quite a vivid and very effective way. For example, this film is also about life in New York, in the city, from the perspective or dealing with or from the vantage point of these characters who are immigrants. They have immigrated to the United States under whatever situation, or they are traveling here and staying here for some extended period of time, again, depending on their various circumstances. And based on those circumstances, we see the characters, primarily, of course, our main character of Ahmed, but also the supporting characters, those people that he meets along the way, And there are some relationships in particular that we see various, shall we say, developments or personal developments of each of these characters, how he or she has, in their own way or in their own respective ways, lived out or are living out the immigrant experience in the United States during this time, the 2000s. And so we get a little bit of people's backgrounds, little hints or clues as to where they came from, and also how their backgrounds and how their experiences are shaping their current existences and experiences living in the city, living in New York, and the encounters that they have along the way. And we see also that this has an effect both, say, emotionally and spiritually and also economically. And we see various degrees of how the characters that we meet along the way, including our main character, how they are dealing with their circumstances and what those circumstances are playing themselves out to be, say, in an economic fashion. And so we see various degrees, and this leads, I think, very implicitly or perhaps very directly to an idea of some kind of approach to class and economics in the 21st century, especially from the immigrant perspective in the city of New York. So on that level, I think the film is giving us this quote-unquote slice of life from these various vantages and perspectives, which is really amazing because it shows us the experience of these people, and it relies, I think, primarily on their interactions, but also gives us information, also withholds information, and so we as viewers become curious and we become engaged because we want to know more about where each of these people has come from. And as the film progresses and we get to know a little bit more about them, including our main character, Ahmed, by the way, then we realize that there is a lot going on in terms of their backgrounds and where they came from, why they are here, and what the circumstances are that they face while they are here. And it's all wrapped in this exploration of, say, the immigrant experience in the 21st century. This is also linked to the 21st century New York landscape after 9/11. So as we know, this is made in 2005, and so we understand that it's set post 9/11. And so part of, or perhaps parallel to, this exploration of the characters themselves directly, also on a broad level in terms of the immigrant experience, is also the perspective, perhaps painted in a direct or nuanced way, of their lives and their livelihoods and their own states of being in this post 9/11 world. And this is a really interesting perspective as well, because I would suggest that in this and in other ways, well, let's take this post 9/11 landscape as an example. I think this shows us how Ramin Bahrani approaches his cinema, because we get these subtle clues or hints from, say, a line of dialogue from a character here, or a reference there, or something, or a mood, or a feeling, or an instance that is not so heavily pronounced in terms of the cinematic style, but rather it is very nuanced and layered. But it does provide some kind of, I think, deep insight into the perspective of these individuals that we follow, as I say, in this post 9/11 world, New York landscape. And so that also is very much part of the exploration here in Man Pushcart and Ramin Bahrani's cinema. And I think that is provided, as I say, in a very subtle and very effective way. So that is yet another level. And I think also we get this idea of human existence and the individual. And this leads to, I think, very philosophical implications, or implications that have a philosophical perspective, namely the meaning of one's life, the meaning of one's existence, and what to do in the event that one feels that one's life is rendered meaningless. And this leads to a very, very wonderfully placed metaphorical link with the idea of Sisyphus, also the myth of Sisyphus, Camus, and the implications of this as they are played out in each of the various characters that we meet, in particular the character, our main character of Ahmed, because we realize that there is this idea of struggle, there is this idea of meaninglessness or perceived meaninglessness to one's existence. There's this idea of hopelessness, and there's also the idea of a type of personal tragedy and how to, if at all, how to overcome such tragedy, if it is indeed possible, and what to do with one's life when one realizes or one is faced with circumstances that suggest to us that perhaps those ideas of tragedy and sadness and hopelessness are, in the long run, or ultimately insurmountable. So what to do in the face of that realization? And I think this film therefore brings us to a very grand and very meaningful exploration on a philosophical level about how to deal with the prospect, if you will, or the potential realization that what it is we do is meaningless. And if that is the case, how do we survive? How do we live on? I think that is inherent in this film, Man Push Cart. And in that context, I would suggest too that we have these various strands, these great links with cinematic traditions of the past. I think a lot has been made, and this is emphasized, I think, really nicely, for example, in the supplements, about Ramin Bahrani and his own background, and perhaps how he found a lot of influence and a lot of inspiration from the works of certain filmmakers from Iran, such as Kiarostami, for example. And also we can see certain links that could be made on a thematic and emotional level with the filmmakers of the Italian neorealism cinema tradition. Also, we see references made, for example, to the French filmmaker Robert Bresson, and how characterizations are presented, how information is given or withheld in a cinematic sense for purposes of the viewer's engagement with a particular character, a particular story. And so these, I think, are great examples. Oh, there's also the example made perhaps to the cinema of Ozu, the Japanese filmmaker Ozu. So these are examples of how this type of say, philosophical-based exploration of these characters, in particular Ahmed, and the hopelessness or meaninglessness of his life, at least as it might be perceived to be, and how one deals with that prospect or that realization, and how this type of cinematic expression seems to be, on the one hand, linked to other cinematic traditions that we've seen from past filmmakers that could be said to be great, maybe influences. And I think Ramin Bahrani himself acknowledges this in, say, the commentary track or some of the other supplements that we find in the Criterion Collection disc. But also, I think in visual terms and also emotional terms, we do see those linkages there. At the same time, of course, we have a dynamic film that is also it has this particular care and real earnestness about it, in how the camera seems to be capturing the real essence of these human beings, and particularly Ahmed, the main character, at the focus and center. And so I think this can be said to be part of the cinema of Bahrani himself, namely the caring earnestness of his cinematic eye, and how he tries to capture something, but tries to capture the real lived-in essence of it, and tries to maintain the nuance and subtlety, of the moment, while still preserving the quote-unquote realism of it. So there is a sense of respecting the moment, but also trying to capture the moment in time with the caring, earnest eye of his camera. And so I think that can be said to be part of the cinema of Bahrani. as expressed in Man Pushcart and in other films, namely the linkages to past cinematic traditions while still maintaining the earnest, good-willed nature of his cinema, and trying to capture something that perhaps would not be the focus of, say, a film set in New York, right? And so this type of examination of these sorts of stories, including the one in Man Pushcart, I think is the hallmark, or one of the hallmarks of why Bahrani's cinema is so brilliant and exciting as it is. So we see it here. We will also see it in another example of his filmography that has also been released by the Criterion Collection, and I'll get to that in a separate video. But returning to Man Pushcart, in conclusion, I should say that this feels so bold and inventive by the very fact that it is very sincere and very subtle, and it doesn't feel like it's trying to force anything. At the same time, it does try to capture the essence of the philosophical questionings or underpinnings that are part of the daily lives and existences of these people that then in turn seem to be representative of a broader spectrum that is borrowed from real life. And these real life borrowings have implied within them various levels of the immigrant experience, the post 9/11 New York landscape, and then on perhaps a universal level, the notion of one's existence in the grand scheme of things, but also in the context of our own intimate lives and perspectives. And so in that way, it becomes this really wonderfully charged cinematic experience that is also earnest and sincere. And it remains, I think, a great example of this 21st century cinema from the filmmaker Ramin Bahrani. So this is the film Man Pushcart. With the release of this film by the Criterion Collection, we have, first of all, a director-approved Blu-ray, as described by Materials, a high-definition digital master presentation of this work. And we have a number of supplements that are part of this package. And so it's, I think, another great example of a Criterion release. So first up, we have a commentary track which is described as being from 2005, and this is with Ramin Bahrani and Michael Simmons, the director of photography, and assistant director Nicholas Elliott, and Ahmet Razbi, the main actor of this film, or he portrays the main character of this film, Ahmet. And so we have these gentlemen speaking in a very casual way together for purposes of this commentary track. And it is really, really wonderful. I really recommend it. Commentary tracks, when they're done well, they are really excellent. And I think this is a great example of this, because there is this lovely casual nature, the rapport between and among these people. And you can tell they have a really nice chemistry. And in that chemistry, what results is their conversation, and they go and they talk about these various details that are, that even when they go on a tangential nature, they are never irrelevant. They are always relevant to the conversation about Man Pushcart, but they are delivered in a way that is very easy to digest, easy to access on the part of viewers and people who are watching the film. And so it feels like one is part of their conversation. Just to give you some examples, they talk, I think, from the outset about some films that were playing in theaters at the time of this commentary track, and they speak, for instance, about, I think, the films of Melville, or also the films of Bresson. And those are not irrelevant comments. In fact, they are very relevant, because they also show not just the cinematic tastes, if you will, of the participants of the commentary, but they are actually links to cinematic traditions that could be said to be influential on the filmmaking style and craft of a film like Man Push Cart. After all, the presentation of a lot of these characterizations, in particular the main character of Ahmet, could be said to be very much in line with the Bressonian nature of character presentation. So this is, and the idea of the modèle. And so in that way, I think references to Bresson are very, very relevant. And that's just an example of how the casual nature, the wonderfully casual nature, leads to some, I think, lovely insights into the perspectives on this film. Other examples include the idea of, or references to not just Sisyphus, but also the myth of Sisyphus and the importance of the Camus text, and how this leads to a very direct philosophical underpinning of Ramin Bahrani's concern with this work, namely what to do when faced with the notion of the meaninglessness of one's life, how to handle that situation, and not just in a philosophical way, but also in a real way, like how can one actually live one's life when one is faced with this possibility of the meaninglessness of one's life. So that is, I think, a real philosophical conundrum that is at the heart of this film, and that is the link between the myth of Sisyphus and this film, and thus the link with Sisyphus in general. But it's also played out very directly in various details and scenes that are discussed in the commentary track as the film Man Push Cart is ongoing. And so these and other details are reasons why the commentary track is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So please, if you have the opportunity, please watch the film with the commentary track. I know you will enjoy it. And to continue on, we have a Criterion Collection produced supplement, which is called Formation of a Filmmaker. And this is a one-on-one conversation between Ramin Bahrani and Hamid Dabashi. And this is described as being recorded in 2020. And it's approximately 19 minutes. This is really nice because we understand that Hamid Dabashi was once a professor of Ramin Bahrani when Ramin Bahrani was at university, at Columbia University. And so we understand that Dabashi was teaching a class on Middle Eastern cinema at the time, and Ramin Bahrani was one of his students. And they have really lovely recollections of their experiences at the time during the university period of Bahrani's life, but then also how this was very much this created this friendship between the two men. And also this leads to a discussion of influences of literature, of certain aspects of Persian literature in particular, on Ramin Bahrani and his life growing up, as well as other cinema influences, both growing up and also as he was a student in classes like Dabashi's class, for example. So they speak here and elsewhere throughout the conversation about, for example, an interesting detail about the films of Yasujiro Ozu, how one could watch them on television in Iran. And so that was a very interesting detail. Also, they spoke a little bit about the types of films that they were watching for purposes of this class on Middle Eastern cinema, and that includes films from filmmakers Amir Naderi and also Abbas Kiarostami. So this is, I think, leading indications as to the various influences that perhaps can be said to be there or in existence when discussing the films of Bahrani, including Man Push Cart and others. And in fact, the connection with the filmmaker Naderi and also the influence of, the connection with Naderi and also the director of photography Michael Simmons is also mentioned. Also, there are references to films like The Runner and in this discussion. So this is, I think, another great, insightful section of this particular discussion, which goes also into other wonderful avenues as to what the beginnings were of Ramin Bahrani's filmmaking career and how he ended up being able to make his film Backgammon. And this film Backgammon, by the way, the short film, is also part of the Criterion Collection supplements. And he speaks then about aspects of his own immigrant experience or his feelings or perspectives as an Iranian American. This is Ramin Bahrani, and so how he was trying to work out his perspective as an Iranian American, and also trying to explore his own roots and heritage. And so he discusses a little bit about how he took a very significant trip to Iran, and so this leads to a discussion about his attempts at trying to create certain film projects there, his experiences there, yet other examples of influences of Iranian cinema, etc. So these are details as to essentially, yes, the formation of the filmmaker that is Ramin Bahrani. And so these details that emerge in this conversation, I think, are what make the conversation itself so essential. So please check it out if you can. Again, it's approximately 19 minutes. It's called Formation of a Filmmaker. And then to continue on with the supplements, we have another one which is called Against All Odds, Making Man Push Cart. This is also from 2020, and it's also seemingly a Criterion Collection produced supplement. This is a conversation in a large room with Ramin Bahrani and Nicholas Elliott and Ahmed Razvi, and they're sitting somewhat separate from each other. I think social distancing is being implemented here, so there is some distance in this large room, but they are talking, and they are they're giving us their stories and episodes about how they came to what ended up becoming Man Push Cart. For instance, how Ramin Bahrani and Nicholas Elliott met, and how Ahmed Razvi ended up becoming a very important part of the production, how he was also able to provide certain insights into the characterization of Ahmed specifically, and also other aspects that were being captured by Ramin Bahrani in his cinema in terms of the so-called immigrant experience, if you will, of this particular character, and all the little details that were very important in the makeup of the cinema to express this overall tableau. And they talk about also the Pakistani American experience, or the roots or heritage of Pakistan, living in the United States or in New York, or in the case of Ahmed Razvi in Midwood or Brooklyn. And so these details, I think, emerge in the discussion, and they're also relevant because they are part of the fabric of Man Push Cart, the work. And so this is very essential. Then they go into other avenues of discussion, like specific details. There's a really interesting episode about the cart itself, and there was a particular instance of a real example of physical fortitude on the part of Razvi and maneuvering the cart. And so this brings up, I think, a really interesting anecdote about the making of the film. And that is yet another example of the richness of this particular supplement, this discussion amongst these gentlemen. Really essential. It's approximately 24 minutes. And we also should say that there's also discussion about how the post-production was had with this film. The editing process is touched upon a bit. And then also the way in which this film essentially became discovered on the festival circuit, and that is a really fascinating story in and of itself. And so Ramin Bahrani shares a little bit of what happened and how it ended up becoming this festival phenomenon that led to the filmmaking career of Ramin Bahrani as we know it. And so there is this really interesting story that he relates about the last minute wait as to what the festivals would react, or their reaction to this film. So please check out that story if you can. Wonderful conversation among these three participants. Again, from 2020, approximately 24 minutes. And then to continue on, we have the short film, which is described as being from 1998. and it's called Backgammon. It's approximately 11 minutes, and this is the film that was referred to in the earlier supplement formation of a filmmaker about how Ramin Bahrani was able to have access to certain materials when he was in North Carolina to be able to make this film, Backgammon. This is an extraordinary work for a number of reasons, because it is obviously one of the early examples of Ramin Bahrani's cinema craft. It's also very much touching upon, quite directly, a lot of the themes that are relevant to a discussion of man-push-cart, the idea of the family dynamic, the idea of growing up in terms of the, in this case, the Iranian-American experience. This is that brings an interesting detail as well, which is, I think, brought up in a discussion that we can find in the subsequent Criterion release called Chop Shop, and I'll get to that in a separate video. But it does talk about how Ramin Bahrani's cinema seems to be focusing in on the immigrant experience of a number of various characters, and how Backgammon is perhaps another example of that, this time in the Iranian-American context, which is something that is, of course, very much personal to Ramin Bahrani and his own background. So that is, I think, lending itself very nicely to another reason why Backgammon is very significant. Also, the story is really well played out, and it leads to generational differences or connections, and the idea of tradition and modernity, and the idea of communication and miscommunication, and the idea of realization and epiphany, and how that's all presented too in the context of childlike innocence and curiosity, as well as the significance and impact of human emotion, and how that can be played out over time, both in the short term and the long term. So there is a lot going on in this work, Backgammon, and to have it included here, not just in the context of man-push-cart, but also in the context of Ramin Bahrani's career as a whole, it's really wonderful. So please check this out if you can as well, Backgammon. And then the supplements are rounded out with a trailer for the film itself. And then the insert, I've taken the liberty of pulling out the insert beforehand. It's a really nice continuation of this artwork representation that we see in the cover art design, which are in essence representations of, or moments of the film, or representations of the film and the main character. And here we have also other types of photographic representations. Here, and there's a little shot of a sticker that also has really significant meaning. And then the essay, which is included, is by Bilge Ebiri, and this is called A Melancholy Pull. And Ebiri's essay is another great example of great essays in the Criterion collection. I love the essays. I love their inclusion. They're very important. And here's another example, because he goes into the many details about the philosophical underpinnings, references to myth of Sisyphus, and also the various themes and dynamics that this film is operating on in terms of the immigrant experience, post 9/11 landscape, in the context of Bahrani's career overall. And then we go into, I think, some really lovely discussions of specific aspects of the film and how it operates, and the various story arcs that are affected along the way, etc., etc. So this becomes yet another essential essay. So Bilge Ebiri's essay, it's called A Melancholy Pull. Please check it out if you can. Again, the essays are wonderful, and Ebiri's essay is another example of that. And with the insert and the essay, that concludes a general overview of what you can find in the release of Man Push Cart. I should say that this film forms, I think, a really nice complement to another Criterion Collection release that I will talk about in a separate video, which is of this film, Chop Shop. And I say this because perhaps there are some supplements included with Chop Shop that are also directly relevant to a discussion of Man Push Cart. So if you are interested in a further exploration examination of Man Push Cart and a further exploration or examination of the works of Bahrani, then I would strongly suggest that you also check out Chop Shop if you haven't already, including the supplement, because as I say, there are a number of discussions that are relevant to Man Push Cart. In particular, there's a discussion here about the so-called immigrant experience in New York and in Queens and Brooklyn, for example, and so and elsewhere. And so that is very relevant to Man Push Cart and also backgammon for that matter. So I encourage you to check this out as well if you are interested. I will again speak about this in a separate video, hopefully very soon. But returning to the Criterion release of Man Push Cart, we are getting quite a good amount of stuff. I mean, perhaps in terms of quantity, on paper it might look to be relatively slim in terms of we're getting 2 supplements plus the short film and then a trailer. So maybe we've seen other Criterion releases where in terms of quantity we have seen more quote-unquote stuff. But I would encourage you to look at the actual content itself, and I would actually say that the content is itself very fascinating and very, very worthwhile. And the commentary track too, as I was trying to indicate before, has this lovely casual nature that is easy to digest, but it also has so many nuggets of inspiration, of information and insight, that make it so worthwhile. So this is my way of saying that the supplements package here is really extraordinary. So please check it out if you can. I can strongly recommend it. This is the Criterion release of Man Push Cart. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.